There is a certain level of poverty below which it is impossible to live the good life. This does not mean, of course, that rich people lead the best lives. One need only glance through the tabloids to see that the wealthy and famous are not insulated from heartache, addiction, and letdowns. It also does not mean that it is impossible to be poor and live well. Last year I had tea in the mud home of a Kenyan family who made no more than a couple of dollars a week and yet who were completely content. However, while it is possible to live a poor life while rich and a rich life while poor, there seems to be a certain level of poverty at which it becomes impossible to live a fully good, a fully human life. If you don't have food or shelter, your life simply cannot be good. If you are sick all the time and have no money or access to health care, it would seem impossible for you to attain a life of the sort that could be called good. If it is true, in other words, that poverty, at least in its most extreme forms, inhibits the living of a good life, then it is a subject necessary for us to discuss. Indeed, insofar as ethics deals with the good life, and insofar as extreme poverty prevents a good life from being lived, the issue of poverty is an ethical issue. As such, any good and complete ethical system must be able to address it adequately. This is, at any rate, the conviction behind our reading for today, Honora O'Neill's The Kantian Formula of the End in Itself and World Hunger. In this article, O'Neill sets out to investigate which ethical systems best provide a proper response to the ethical problem of world poverty. Before beginning this investigation, however, she lays down two conditions that must be met if poverty is to be sufficiently dealt with. First, in order for an ethical system to offer a proper response to poverty, or so O'Neill claims, it must tell us how we should not treat the poor. In other words, a proper response to poverty will make it a moral obligation that we ensure that the poor are never interfered with in such a way that keeps them from living the good life. Second, in order for an ethical system to offer a proper response to poverty, it must tell us how we should treat the poor. In other words, it must make it a moral obligation for us to actively work to secure some sort of good life for the poor. I don't know about you, but these two conditions seem reasonable to me. So let's see how O'Neill sees some of the major ethical systems as meeting, or as the case may be, not meeting these conditions. First of all, let's look at utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, if you remember, claims that we must always act in order to increase happiness in the world. With this as a starting point, the utilitarian will likely start addressing the issue of poverty by observing that the extremely poor are, well, unhappy. As it is our moral obligation to increase happiness in the world, it is therefore our obligation to do something about all the unhappy poor people if the total happiness of the world is to be increased. So far, so good. Unfortunately, O'Neill points out, here's where a problem comes in. Namely, while utilitarians are morally obligated to increase happiness in the world, there's no specific way in which they are required to do this. This is a bad thing in the case of poverty. For it could very well be, O'Neill points out, that the best way to increase happiness in the world would be to, let's say, euthanize all the poor. Indeed, if the poor are all dead, their unhappiness is buried with them, and thus no longer brings the happiness total of the world down. But if this is the case, then utilitarianism completely fails at meeting both conditions laid out by O'Neill that go into a proper response to poverty. Indeed, the utilitarian response fails to make it morally obligatory to ensure that the poor are not interfered with in their attempt to live the good life. Very much the opposite. It potentially commands us to interfere with and go as far as potentially killing the poor. Similarly, utilitarianism fails to make it morally obligatory for us to help the poor secure the good life. Since utilitarianism thus fails to meet both conditions, O'Neill tosses it out as inadequate to address the issue of poverty. Next then, O'Neill asks us to consider rights-based ethics. Ethics of these sort, if you remember, say that there are basic human rights which must never be violated. If we are to use rights-based ethics to respond to poverty, we would thus begin by observing that extremely poor people have many of their basic rights violated. For instance, anyone who is starving is having their right to life violated. Therefore, the rights-based ethicist will claim it is morally obligatory for us to protect the rights of the poor. Indeed, a response to poverty that grows out of rights will say that there are certain things we simply cannot do to the poor. In other words, such a response to poverty will say that we are morally obligated to ensure that the poor are not interfered with in such a way that keeps them from living the good life. In making this morally obligatory, rights-based ethics thus meets the first condition for a proper response to poverty as laid out by O'Neill. However, rights-based ethics does not meet the second condition for a proper response to poverty. Namely, rights-based ethics do not tell us what we should do to help the poor. They do not tell us that we are morally obligated to in some way help the poor secure the good life. Indeed, rights-based theory may be able to tell us that we can not take away the life of a poor person, and it may tell us that we cannot take away the land of the poor. However, it says nothing about any obligations beyond this. It does not say that we are morally obligated to provide education to the poor once we have ensured that they are kept alive. It does not say, for instance, that we are morally obligated to teach the poor man how to farm once we have ensured that he keeps his property. While a rights-based response to poverty therefore meets the first condition of a proper response to poverty as laid out by O'Neill, by making it a moral obligation that we don't do certain things to the poor, it does not make the things we should do for the poor a moral obligation, and so does not meet the second condition. Indeed, rights may tell us to refrain from interfering with the poor in ways that make it impossible for them to live the good life, but they cannot tell us that we should be working to secure a good life for the poor. There is, however, or so O'Neill wants to claim, an ethical system which can meet both conditions for a proper response to poverty. This ethical system is Kantianism. Indeed, Kantianism is able to both tell us what we should and should not do for the poor. In other words, it makes it a moral obligation both for us to ensure that the poor are not interfered with so as to make it impossible for them to attain the good life, and makes it a moral obligation for us to actively attempt to secure a good life for the poor. Kantianism does this, as we will see in a second, through the categorical imperative, the rule that says that we must treat people not as mere means, but also as ends. The rule to treat people not as means, but also as ends, begins O'Neill, contains two parts. The first of these parts says not to treat people as mere means. Now, O'Neill points out the poor are clearly treated as means all the time. Indeed, when we force the poor to work for ridiculously low wages, we are treating them as a means to the end of a large profit. So then, insofar as Kantianism makes it morally obligatory for us to refuse to treat people as means, we must refuse any sorts of behavior that treat the poor in this way. This part of the categorical imperative, by telling us to refuse to treat people as means, thus tells us how the poor should not be treated. Indeed, it makes it morally obligatory for us to ensure that the poor are never interfered with in such a way that keeps them from living the good life. Therefore, this half of the categorical imperative meets the first condition of O'Neill's proper response to poverty. This is, however, only half of the Kantian picture. Indeed, Kant tells us not only that we should not treat people as a means, but also that we should treat them as ends. In other words, for the Kantian, we are morally obligated to treat all people, the poor obviously included, as worthy in and of themselves. To give some examples of this, this means that it is not enough for a Kantian to allow a poor man to keep his land. Doing this merely fulfills our duty to not treat him as a means. Indeed, a Kantian is further obligated to treat this man as worthy in and of himself, to treat the man as an end. The Kantian is thus obligated to take the time to teach the man how to farm better, or to ensure that his children have a proper education, and so on and so forth. In short, the Kantian is morally obligated not only to ensure that the poor have the ability to achieve the good life, but are further obligated to actually help secure this good life for the poor. As such, concludes O'Neill, Kantianism, unlike either utilitarianism or rights-based ethics, tells us what we should and should not do for the poor. Indeed, only Kantianism makes it a moral obligation for us to both ensure that the poor have the ability to live the good life and to actually help the poor in the attempt to secure this good life. Therefore, Kantianism, by making both of these morally obligatory, offers the best and only appropriate way of responding to the ethical problem of poverty. Finding an ethical system that outlines an appropriate way for responding to poverty, however, is quite different than actually responding to poverty. Indeed, the issue of poverty, like many issues in ethics, is only ever truly and adequately addressed when we begin acting in real and tangible ways in an attempt to remedy it.